Hey guys, welcome to Chapter 40, A World Without Borders. And this chapter basically talks about globalization in modern day. And it's officially the last chapter of Traditions and Encounters. So, yay, we finished this together. And so you can find this outline and all the other outlines in the Google Drive description link below. And so let's begin. This outline begins by talking about the global economy, which is the economy we live in today. And the first word we encounter is free trade, which basically means trade that's free of state-imposed restrictions. So any trade that does not necessarily follow any rules outlined by a particular country. And free trade is good because it can limit the amount of tariffs, which are taxes on trade, quotas, which are limits on trade, and embargoes, which are complete bans on trade imposed by a single country. And one example of a free trade organization is the World Trade Organization, or WTO, and it was formed in 1947, and in 1994 it got its official name of World Trade Organization. And another example of a trade organization is the European Union, and this is for Europe. And the European Union began in 1957. It began with 6 nations, and now it's expanded to 15. And its goal was to create a common market, free trade, and free travel between member countries in Europe. And they also adopted a common currency, the euro. And countries don't have to use this currency, but many of them do because it makes trade so much easier. Another example would be OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and this basically just regulates much of the gasoline and petroleum produced in the world. In America, we have NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and basically it includes North American countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and it promotes free trade over in North America. As a part of the global economy, some problems have been introduced, such as population pressures and environmental degradation. So as industrialization progressed, people had the capability to grow their families and also have more kids. And this skyrocketed the global population, and Asia and Africa experienced the most of this. And so today there are concerns that this population growth is too much and eventually it will outpace the carrying capacity of the planet. And because of that, environmental problems have arisen as well. And you can read all about that here. And one such environmental impact is global warming, and that's when humans have burned too much greenhouse gases, and it's caused the whole planet to act like a greenhouse and trap all the extra heat from the UV rays so it can't disperse. And this has caused an increase in world temperatures throughout the years. And so people have attempted to try to fix this, but of course we're still working on it. Another problem for humans is global diseases. One of them is HIV/AIDS, and it was first found in San Francisco. And right now there's a big epidemic in Africa where a lot of people have it. HIV is the disease that eventually causes AIDS, and it's threatening a lot of African societies who cannot afford treatment. Over to global terrorism, one of the biggest that we might know in our lifetime is September 11, 2001, also known as 9/11. Basically, extremists and terrorists decided they didn't like some of the values America stood for, so they went and they crashed airplanes into some important buildings in the United States. And this was fueled by Islamic fundamentalism, IF here, and that's also another word. Basically, these are Muslims who really want to go back to the original conservative roots of Islam, and as a result, sometimes they take an extreme view, sometimes not always. And the ones that do take an extreme view, sometimes they become terrorists, and that's when we have terror attacks like 9/11. To counter some of these problems, there are NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. Examples are the Red Cross and Greenpeace. Red Cross is like a humanitarian agency, so it helps wars and stuff, and Greenpeace tries to preserve the earth. And these are basically organizations that help people around the world, but they're not affiliated with a particular country, so they kind of travel around and are exempt from any one country's particular rules. Another sort of organization is the United Nations, and this was a follow-up to the League of Nations, which failed previously. And basically, it wants to maintain international peace and security, and this was founded after World War II to try to prevent a World War III. And sometimes people say it doesn't really help out, but sometimes people say it does. And this has led to some humanitarian aid and protests. So sometimes the humanitarian aid given out by these organizations isn't fairly distributed, or sometimes that there are protests about how this humanitarian aid actually goes to. And all these problems sometimes lead to protests, and that's what humanitarian aid and protests by these NGOs and organizations really talk about. There's a whole section about feminism and how women have increased their rights around the world. Even though patriarchy is still pretty high today, it's been much improved since earlier times, and you can read about that here. And so finally, I'll go over three terms. The three terms are IMF, Solidarity, and Gulf Wars. So basically, IMF stands for International Monetary Fund, and that's basically sort of like an NGO around the world that attempts to sort of try to make the global monetary system cooperate, and they really want financial stability and high economic trade, and they really just want growth for all nations who are trying to become industrialized. So it's just like an international money fund for a lot of these countries. Solidarity is a movement in the early 1980s, and it was an independent labor union in the Soviet Union, but eventually it became broad, and it was nonviolent and anti-communist. It basically wanted to overthrow the communist regime in the Soviet Union, and it eventually led to the fall and the rise of Russia and other countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. And finally, there were two Gulf Wars. The first one was between Iraq and Kuwait in 1990 and 1991. Basically, Iraq under Saddam Hussein wanted the oil fields and many other political issues in Kuwait, so they invaded. So the U.S. and a global coalition came together and forced them out. In the Gulf War II, a similar thing happened, except this time it was Iraq again. And the U.S. thought Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and so these are like nuclear missiles, poisonous gases, so they really didn't want that. So once again, they went in and they tried to find the weapons, but they didn't really find any. And eventually, they didn't have much luck, so they bailed out in 2008, 2009. So that's basically the closest it gets to us, in our time period at least. And so this has been Chapter 40, A World Without Borders, and it talks about the global economy we live in today. So thanks for joining me, and hope to see you next time.